and then I'll talk about some of the projects and some of the outcomes that we've been involved in relation to electronic invoicing. I then introduce you to the panelists for the rest of the webinar and give you a little bit of background on them. And then we'll quickly go into the presentations from each of the panelists. And at the end, we'll have a question and answer session. But there is an ability to ask a question at any time at the bottom of your screen. The facility is there. So we really would welcome your questions and don't be afraid to ask any questions that you have. So next slide, please. Uh, my name is Porrick Hart. I'm a lecturer with the Atlantic Technological University, and I'm based on the Sligo campus, and that was formerly the Institute of Technology in Sligo. And we've been involved in researching electronic invoicing for many years at this stage. And we've been involved right at the beginning where we had a pilot project for Irish government that proved that electronic invoices were capable of being sent by private sector to Irish public bodies. And moving on from that, the Connecting European Facility was an EU instrument arm that whose aim was to promote the successful uptake of electronic invoicing in Europe, particularly respecting the European standard on electronic invoicing and the EU directive in relation to it as well and public procurement. They made substantial funding available, and we made several applications to the funding um, for grants to help with electronic invoicing. They had certain building blocks to help build a digital Europe. And one of the building blocks was e-invoicing, and another one was e-delivery, which was to do with delivering messages in a secure and reliable manner. But we made several applications to the e-invoicing Connecting European Facility, and you'll see the outcome of those applications now. Next slide, please. Okay, it ended up in 7 EU-funded projects, and we had partners, as you can see over there from our map, spread across a diverse range of European countries, from Sweden, Ireland, Spain, Malta, Italy, to name but a few. The partners themselves were governments from various countries, including Irish government, and that could be central government or state functions like the local authorities in Ireland or the health service executive or the educational department, the ECBs in Ireland, just to name a few. And we had SMEs involved as well, because obviously SMEs are very, very important in the whole electronic invoicing journey and to show how they can benefit from using the invoices. We had multinational corporations involved, and we went right down and we were very, very enthusiastic. We even got local communities involved in adopting electronic invoicing as well. And the outcomes from these projects were really, really beneficial. Uh, we were able to prove, first of all, that it was possible to send electronic invoices to government. We were able to show the governments and the public bodies that it was able to automatically process these invoices, getting great benefit from automated processing. We were able to show SMEs, and we actually once had a seminar where one of the SMEs that was sending invoices says, biggest benefit for us was faster payment. So it showed that there was fantastic outcomes, and we were able to actually harness the electronic invoice to make it much more smart and much more intelligent. And one of the exciting outcomes that I think we had was we used machine learning and artificial intelligence to help identify rogue invoices, and it was really, really, really beneficial. That's my background on ATU, Sligo's background. So moving on to the next slide, we have panelists. And the panelists that we have today are um, Nolan Campbell. Nolan is the Senior Scientific Officer at the NSAI and is the National Secretary for the NSAI Standards Committee on e-invoicing. Nolan covers both the ICT and electro-technical standards area with, within the Innovation Policy and Business Development Unit. and we look forward to hearing from Noreen today. Then we have Declan McCormick. Declan is Head of Operational Excellence at the Office of Government Procurement, better known as OGP. The OGP has been invested with the procurement policy, and especially electronic invoices fall within that procurement policy. And Declan has responsibility as a principal officer for the National E-Invoicing Ireland programme. And that program was established to facilitate and enable public bodies comply with the requirements of the European E-Invoicing Directive, and also to achieve benefits just beyond compliance. The third and final panelist today is Edmund Gray, and Edmund is chair of the NSAI e-Procurement SC. He's part of the management team of CEN TC 434 that developed the e-invoicing standard that's now mandated throughout Europe. He's over 30 years IT experience and has advised the EU Commission and both UK and Irish government on the implementation of e-procurement standards, particularly e-invoicing. So as you can see, we have a very, very exciting set of panelists today. And without further ado, I now hand you over to Noreen Campbell. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Pádraig, for that. Welcome, everybody. My name is Nolene Campbell, and I'm a Standards Officer with the National Standards Authority of Ireland, NSAI. And today I'll be giving you some background to standards and the standardization process, and briefly taking a look at the e-invoicing standard and its parts. Next slide, please. So what is a standard? Well, a standard is a document with agreed rules, guidelines, or definitions on how to make a product, manage a process, deliver a service, or supply materials, and it's voluntary in application. There are many different types of standards, and possibly you're most familiar with management system standards, such as ISO 9000 Family of Quality Management Standards that define an effective quality assurance system for an organization, or perhaps the cybersecurity and data protection set of standards, EN 27000. There are vocabulary and terminology standards so that we have a common understanding of terms, definitions, and symbols or signs within a subject matter. And there are test method standards, which are useful to standardize the way a test or analysis is carried out. Also, specification standards are used for setting out the minimum requirements for products or services that should be met to ensure that the product performs safely. Next slide, please. So what's the process of developing a standard? Well, a standard is developed within a committee, which consists of a wide variety of stakeholders from industry, academia, consumer organizations, regulators, research institutes, etc. And the development of a standard is based on a consensus decision-making approach. And generally how the process works is a project is proposed by a committee member, and once it has the support of other members, it becomes a work item, which that committee or one of its working groups will focus on. The draft standard is created by the group, and once it gets to a certain stage, it's sent out for public inquiry, and the general public then gets a chance to comment and vote on the draft. The comments are then considered by the expert committee, and eventually the standard is published. A standards committee is a neutral forum where everyone has an equal voice, and this open and transparent environment gives the many different stakeholders an opportunity to meet and work together in a way they wouldn't normally be able to. Next slide, please. So what are the benefits of standards or getting involved in standards? Well, standards help organizations gain that competitive advantage as products which implement them give confidence to the consumer buyer that the product is safe or reliable, or indeed interoperable. A standardized product is much more marketable at both EU and global level, and organizations that are certified to a standard improve their reputation and recognition. Standards also enable companies to comply with relevant laws and regulations, and frequently the European Commission mandates standardization work to be carried out by the European standards organizations, and the resulting standards produced under these mandates help organizations demonstrate their compliance with the legal requirements. Standardization has also been proven to help bridge the gap between research and the market, and most research projects under Horizon Europe programme have a standards element now included. And when you become part of the standards development process, you're joining a global network of experts in your field where knowledge is shared, and it's also a great networking opportunity. Next slide, please. So NSAI is the national standards body for Ireland, and we have many standards committees working on standards across all sectors, which cover topics such as artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, construction, healthcare, e-accessibility, and of course, e-invoicing. And NSAI is a member of several European and international standards organizations as shown in this slide. The three standards organizations at European level are CEN, CENELEC, and ETSI, and they focus on certain areas such as e-invoicing, safety of machinery, face masks, hydrogen, air quality, etc. And that's in CEN. And then in CENELEC is the organization which is focused on electrotechnical standardization. It looks at areas such as solar PV systems, power transformers, cables, etc. And then ETSI mainly develops standards in the area of telecoms and communication. And their international equivalents are ISO for CEN, IEC for CENELEC, and ITU for ETSI. So through our national committees, we give our experts the opportunity to comment and vote on standards and to participate directly in the European and international committees. Next slide, please. And so within CEN's Technical Committee 434 on electronic invoicing, a number of 16931 standard documents have been produced as shown here. And if you're thinking of implementing the standard for e-invoicing, it's a good idea to be familiar with the different parts and their titles and scopes. And a preview of each of these is available through NSAI's online shop, which is through our website. So part 1 defines the semantic data model of the core elements of an electronic invoice, and a second amendment is being produced for this currently. The core invoice model contains information elements that are commonly used and accepted, including those that are legally required. Part 2 gives the list of syntaxes that comply with part 1. And then part 3 is divided into 4 parts. Part 3.1 is the methodology for syntax bindings of the core elements of an electronic invoice. Part 3.2 gives the syntax binding for ISO IEC 19845. Part 3.3 is the syntax binding for UN CFACT XML. Then the next slide shows part 3.4 is the syntax binding for UN EDIFACT. Part 4 gives guidelines on the interoperability of e-invoices at the transmission level. Part 5 gives guidelines on the use of sector or country-specific extensions. Part 6 then specifies the methodology used for testing at a semantic level and at the syntax level. Part 7 gives guidance on the creation and implementation of a SIUS, or Core Invoice Usage Specification, and defines a clear set of criteria which a SIUS should comply with. Part 8 is still currently under development and describes the content of electronic simplified invoices and e-receipts, and describes business processes in which simplified invoices and e-receipts are exchanged. So next slide, please. But today, the standard which contains the core elements and which is of most interest to you is ISEN 16931 Part 1. And this standard, along with Part 2, is freely available from the NSAI Standards online shop. And the web address for this is shown on my last slide. And Edmund and Declan will be speaking in more detail about the implementation of the standard, as well as the very useful guide developed by our National Committee. But for some background, in 2014, the European Commission mandated CEN to prepare a standard or standard documents to support the essential requirements of Directive 2014/55 EU on electronic invoicing and public procurement. This European standard is needed to help businesses who wish to carry out cross-border procurement activities, because having to comply with different national standards each time you enter a new market is costly and it discourages competition. And additionally, national standards do not allow for interoperability. The digital invoices can be transmitted as files through computer messaging networks, but different types of digital documents have different characteristics that affect how they can be processed. In accordance with the directive, the European standard on e-invoicing specifies invoices in a standardized structured data format that provides for automatic reading of the data by computer systems. EU countries are bound to implement this standard. So e-invoices, according to IS-EN 16931, will have to be accepted by these countries. This helps to support the EU's digital strategy, which aims to make digital transformation work for people and businesses, while helping also to support the Green Deal and to achieve a target of a climate neutral Europe by 2050. Next slide, please. So if you want to get involved in standards, well, NSAI is always looking for new members who can bring their expertise to the table. If you just go to our website and click on standards and want to get involved in standards and complete the registration form, then we'll get back in touch with you. Next slide. Or alternatively, if you don't want to become a committee member, you can always have your say by commenting on the draft standards through the public inquiry process. Just register with us again on our website. Click on standards, your say, go to the portal and generate an account. Then you can search your area of interest and for the relevant draft standards to read and comment on. Next slide. So thank you very much for your attention. This is our website address, www.nsai.ie. Our online standard shop is also here, the address for that, and my email address should you need to get in contact. So I'll now pass you back to Porrick. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Nolan, for that, and that was very, very interesting. And I think core to Nolan's presentation there was that it gives us confidence in e-invoicing, because we see now the rigorous and collaborative approach to creating any standard. So the e-invoicing standard that was created followed that type of approach. And because of that, then we can see that this standard will help public and private sectors to be competitive and innovative. And also, because of this interoperability, it'll make it easier to exchange invoices in a digital world. Already we have some questions coming in, but I just repeat it once again. At the bottom of the chat there, there's an opportunity for you to ask questions. So please feel free to do so. And now we'll move on to our next panelist, Declan McCormack from the OGP. Declan.
Thanks, Porrick. Hello, everyone, and thank you for taking the time out today to join the webinar. I'm delighted to be part of it, and I'd just like to take this opportunity to thank the NSAI team for hosting and organising it all. As Porrick said, my name is Declan McCormack. I'm Head of Operational Excellence at the Office of Government Procurement. And in my presentation, I'd like to cover three main areas. So firstly, just to give some context to the role of e-invoicing within the broader public procurement landscape. Secondly, to set out the key elements of current legislation and government policy on e-invoicing. And thirdly, to outline the national approach to implementing e-invoicing in public procurement. So if we could go to the next slide before I get into specifics on e-invoicing, I'd just like to give you a quick background on the Office of Government Procurement, or the OGP as we're known. The OGP was established in 2014, and we have responsibility for leading the public procurement reform program, and we also have responsibility for public procurement policy, strategy, and operations. The majority of our staff work in our sourcing function, establishing and servicing frameworks and contracts for our public body clients to access goods and services they need. But we do also have dedicated teams for helping our customers to access and engage with the services we deliver, for collecting and analysing public procurement related statistical data from across the public sector, and for implementing procurement related strategic and policy initiatives. So the European e-invoicing directive, which was transposed into Irish law in 2019, is one such policy initiative that the OGP has played a key role in facilitating the national approach to the implementation of the legislation. So if we could go to the next slide, please. From a general standpoint, the potential benefits of making the greater use of digital in the delivery of public services and public administration are well established at this stage. Digital has been on the agenda for public and private organizations for many years now, and I think the points made on this slide will be nothing new to the people on the webinar today. And public procurement is no different. The greater application of digital in public procurement, or e-procurement as it's often referred to, can help reap those common benefits. So whether it's to drive efficiencies in operations, to help simplify how businesses access opportunities, and to establish common standards for procurement processes and data across EU member states. Having better data enables informed decision making and can lead to unforeseen benefits as we gain new insights through that data. And not least of all, making the greater use of digital facilitates and enables the urgent need for us all to do more in terms of lessening our impact on the environment. If we could go to the next slide, please. So from a European perspective, one of the strengths of the European Union is its belief in cross-border standards in procedures and data, and in particular where those standards serve to protect competition in the single market, which is increasingly becoming a digital single market. So if we look at the breakdown of the steps in the e-procurement lifecycle, we can quickly see the direction of travel that the EU has been steering member states towards over the last number of years. We've seen the introduction of European legislation and standards to help digitize a number of those steps so far. So it's mandatory for public procurement opportunities to be advertised online. It's mandatory for member states to enable suppliers access information about those opportunities online. It's mandatory for public procurement for contracting authorities and member states to facilitate suppliers submitting their responses to public procurement opportunities electronically. And so what the EU in effect is doing is setting out a gradual but purposeful route to standardized end-to-end e-procurement. And e-invoicing is the latest digital capability that since 2019 has been mandatory for public bodies to support. If we could go to the next slide, please, Oisin. Thank you. So in terms of national legislation and policy, well, as I mentioned, the national legislation was driven by a European directive, the E-Invoicing directive. And in a nutshell, the national legislation basically requires all public bodies to have made the necessary provisions to be able to receive and process electronic invoices where a supplier wishes to submit EU standard compliant e-invoices. So this law came into effect for central government public bodies in 2019 and in effect for all public bodies since April 2020. The legislation is somewhat unusual in that it specifically references the European standard for e-invoicing. And the reason, I suppose, behind that, like a key aim of the European directive was to drive the use of standardized, structured digital invoice data across all EU member states in order to simplify the administrative burden on suppliers in doing business across Europe and to allow for the greater automatic processing of invoices and efficiencies that can be gleaned from that by public administrations. So from a legislative perspective, the one other point is noteworthy, and I think that's just at the moment, at this time, it does remain optional for suppliers to submit invoices electronically in public procurement. In terms of policy, however, a national approach to the implementation of e-invoicing has been established, and it very much builds on the use of standards. So in terms of so I suppose implementations, in addition to supporting the European e-invoicing standard for structured digital invoice data, all implementations should also enable the submission or the electronic delivery of electronic invoices through the PEPL network. Now, the PEPL network is an international open standards-based network. It's well established across Europe and facilitates the exchange of public procurement electronic messages and documents between businesses and government. And by way of example, in Norway, where electronic invoicing and electronic ordering is mandatory in public procurement, PEPL, all those messages are processed completely through the PEPL network. So you can think of, I suppose, PEPL as along the lines of a mobile phone network, in that it operates on standards, and it allows for different, I suppose, endpoint implementations to connect to it. So a national approach that supports both these standards, PEPL and the EU standard, allows for diversity of public bodies in terms of the different levels of requirements they might have and interfacing with the range of financial systems that are in operation across the public sector. With all implementations connected to the PEPL network, it means that a supplier needs only to connect to one network, the PEPL network, to allow it to submit e-invoices to any public body. So it's that what's known as the connect once and connect to all principle that is the real value add of going down this standards PEPL based approach. Oisin, if we could go to the next slide, please. This slide shows a visual representation of the national implementation approach. So what we see here is different types of the parties involved in e-invoicing. So there's public bodies that provide finance shared services to communities of public bodies in the public sector. There's public bodies that operate individually and are responsible for processing their own invoices, and there's suppliers. And at the heart of it all is the European Union e-invoicing standard and the PEPL network. So all parties are connected to each other via the PEPL network and are sharing invoice data in the format of the European e-invoicing standard. So to break it down, I guess, in order to be able to receive invoices, any public body that is responsible for invoice processing should establish a connection to the PEPL network in order to and then in order to submit invoices to public bodies, suppliers would also then be required to avail of a service or implement a solution that enabled them to connect to the PEPL network. There is an established market of PEPL certified solutions that support the European standard, and they provide access and solutions for all scales of invoice processing systems and volumes to the PEPL network. So while public bodies are subject, all public bodies are subject to the e-invoicing, to the requirement to be e-invoicing enabled, the national approach puts a specific focus on the main finance shared services functions across the public service. Over time, these functions are expected to process the main volumes of invoices in the public service, and the range of public bodies that they service is growing all the time. So with these shared services enabled for e-invoicing, we believe that they're best placed to help supplier adoption of e-invoicing reach critical mass and then generate the benefits for everybody involved. If we could go to the next slide, Oisin, please. Thank you. So we do know that progress along the road to reaping the benefits is gradual. Compliance with legislation is the first objective for many public bodies. And there's a continuous need to build awareness among the key stakeholders and indeed with suppliers. However, some public bodies, including shared services, are proactively seeking to increase the uptake of e-invoicing among their supplier community, and others are also seeking to go beyond e-invoicing and to drive greater automated processing in terms of electronic ordering. But it does take time, but in time, these steps will lead to more automated process, better information, and more informed decision making. Next slide, please, Oisin. Thank you. There is an e-invoicing area on the OGP's website, and up there we've tried to put as much information as we can to help all the parties that would have a role to play in e-invoicing. So I'd encourage anybody with an interest to check it out and visit it and look at the various pieces of information up there. But there's one recent addition that I'd like to draw your attention to, and it's the guidance on the use of the European e-invoicing standard with the main shared services in the public service. This informational aid was developed through the NSAI's e-procurement committee, and it is hoped that it will be of help to suppliers and or their finance system shared service providers or e-invoicing service providers in establishing what is needed to prepare and submit an EU standard compliant e-invoice for processing for payment by the shared services. It's there's not much complexity in it. It's fairly straightforward. But while the EU standard itself sets out all the fields that must or can be contained in a compliant invoice, this document identifies data requirements and any business rules that are specific to the main shared services as allowed for within the standard itself. Next slide, please. So as for the road ahead, well, you know, we do recognize there are challenges, but for every challenge there is an opportunity, and there are certainly far more opportunities that arise through the greater use of digital than there are challenges. And so in conclusion, the direction of travel towards the greater use of digital and public procurement is a sure thing. That is the direction we're traveling. The motivation for traveling that direction is strengthened with each step we take towards that direction. And in effect, we're all striving to simplify and streamline doing business with the public sector, and in particular for SMEs. We're striving to enable more informed decision making, and we're striving to lessen our impact on the environment. So that's the end of my presentation. As I think Porrick said, there's an opportunity for questions that I think that will come to towards the end. But thank you for taking the time to hear me out.
Thank you, Declan, for that. That was most interesting. And I think to summarise in a way, we've really seen how Irish government has adopted e-invoices and for greater use of digital with the obvious goal being to achieve benefits. And we see that the EU is supporting this all the way, and they see it as a key way of supporting and protecting the single market. And I thought that was very interesting that Declan mentioned that some countries already have made it mandatory to send e-invoices through the PayPal network. So if you want to send an invoice, you must send it to no longer a paper invoice. It has to be an e-invoice, and it has to be sent through the PayPal network. Finally, there, I thought it was very interesting that Declan shared with us, as we had talked earlier, about the rollout in Ireland, and we've seen that it's very much based on a shared service model, and we have a shared service for central government, and they are actively adopting e-invoices with great success. We have another shared service with the local authorities, and the local authorities are pushing this out to their suppliers as well. One of the first was the education shared service for the ECBs, and finally we have the health service shared service. And when you think of the massive amount of transactions that they're processing, and we'll see that their adoption is going to help to achieve this critical mass that Declan talked about. I suppose to summarise in a way, I was just thinking you could say that the e-invoice train has pulled out of the station and it's gaining speed at a fair rate. So thank you very much for Declan. Our final presenter is Edmund Gray, and we're going to hand over to Edmund now, who's going to talk about the future of electronic invoices and the mandates in the EU. So Edmund, over to you.
Thanks, Porrick. So what I'm talking about is I suppose what Declan coined the road ahead, or at least part of what's coming down the road, future electronic invoice mandates in the EU and how they're going to be standardized. So next slide, please. So the driver on this is tax and VAT gaps. So I think it was in 2014 that the UN came up with this concept and wrote a report on it. And since then, the European Commission has brought out 2 reports, also specifically about the EU. And then that drove other initiatives. And the key thing is that this is a loss of billions of dollars. And so the European Parliament and the Commission see that the key part of this is to automate the tax report, the VAT return particularly, and to make sure that there is no fraudulent behavior, because the current system is open to fraud, and there's been some of those defined already. And a key document in this automation is the electronic invoice. And so we're going to look at the current state globally, but more specifically in the EU, and then what impact that's going to have on, especially on SMEs. So next slide, please. So let's look at the global landscape. And so here's an infographic that on the left-hand side is showing the conventional tax reporting system, tax reporting that's there, which is disconnected from invoicing. And then over on the right-hand side, we have it's evolved into e-invoicing, replacing tax reporting mechanisms. And in the middle, then we have a digital tax report with e-invoicing as the underlying cornerstone. And so you can see there that a lot of European countries have taken that approach. And Italy specifically is in the e-invoicing, replacing tax reporting mechanisms. But on the left-hand side, we have the UK and Ireland, who are using still conventional tax reporting, albeit through web submissions. So we'd have the longest road to go, but I suppose we'd have a greenfield site. So I suppose, unlike some countries that may have to change to adapt into a more common system, Ireland can just adopt this. And it's going to be something similar, I expect, to be the way PAYE went there last year. And so you can have your accounting system at the touch of a button to send your tax report to revenue. So next slide, please. So we already saw from Declan mentioned PEPAL, and one of the things about PEPAL you might have, some of you already know, is the four-corner model. So that's what's been used for electronic invoices and orders and other documents at the moment. And in Italy, who also use PEPAL, there is a five-corner model effectively, and the fifth corner being the government. And so all transactions in this case go through government, and so they can, don't need a report then, because the government has all the invoices already. And then we have, in the case of Chile and Mexico, we have a clearance model. And that, if you can see there, the first transaction goes to government and they reply. And in this reply, you would have a number, which you have to put on the invoice to prove that you've been authorized to move the goods. So it's a bit, in Europe, we have the wine and other goods going on a similar system when they move from warehouses, from bonded warehouses, for the excise system. So in Chile and Mexico, no goods are moved until they get this clearance. So a summary of the invoice is sent into government, and then they get clearance. And then we have real-time reporting, or probably near real-time reporting. So after you send the invoice to your service, to your buyer, you then report as now maybe it might be a month, but that's what one of the things that has to be decided in TC 434, where all these are going to be looked at and try to get consensus on which is the best system. So next slide, please. So there are challenges, many solutions with many variations. So we have annual reporting, daily reporting, quarterly reporting, bi-monthly, monthly, and then you have different formats, what's included in those reports. And South America, as I mentioned, has a clearance thing built into that as well. So we have to look and see what is happening in the EU specifically. So I suppose what will typically happen, like what happened in electronic invoicing, there'll be a study set up in a couple of months' time that will look at all the systems that are in place, particularly, I suppose, what's in PEPAL, and try to come up with an agreeable solution for tax report, for VAT returns particularly. Next slide, please. So this will lead to a new standard, obviously, for the system. Next slide, please. So similar to what happened with electronic invoice, initiatives are started between the European Commission and the European Parliament. And earlier this year, on the 10th of March, the Parliament voted on and approved a resolution. And so I have the text here, more or less what is in that resolution, and the link is at the bottom of the page if you want to get more details. But basically, Parliament notes the unprecedented impact and magnitude of COVID-19 crisis on the economy. And this has led to a decrease in tax revenues because I suppose everybody was staying at home and, you know, we didn't have so much volumes of trade. And so that led to a decrease in tax revenues. And then there was an increase in spend to protect society, so buying the vaccines and so on, and paying for people to stay at home when they were sick. So all of this thing led to an increase in debt. And on the other hand, then tax avoidance, tax fraud, tax evasion undermine these revenues. So a lot more money could be taken in if there was a more robust system in place. So next slide, please. So the European Parliament set up an action plan as part of this resolution. So there's a dual approach, as it says there. One is combating tax fraud and tax evasion, and the other is simplifying the steps to remove unnecessary obstacles and burdens, especially for citizens and SMEs. So the simplification is there because, as you can see, 30% of the tax burden is in the cost of compliance with tax rules for an SME, whereas with large companies, it works out at only about 2%. So this is something that has to be addressed. So because SMEs represent 99% of businesses in the European Union and create 2 out of 3 private sector jobs. So by simplifying the reporting process, we can reduce the burden and therefore maybe get easier adoption. Next slide, please. So this is a quote from the resolution as well. The EU Parliament observes that the current Union VAT system remains too complex, especially for SMEs, and vulnerable to fraud, while generating high compliance costs for economic operators, and notes that the different measures to tackle fraud are adopted in the member states, recalls that the modernization of the VAT system should be addressed urgently. So that's the new electronic reporting they want, and stresses that tackling the VAT gap and tax fraud should be an urgent priority. So it has been noted that even criminal gangs are using this loophole to avoid paying VAT, and expresses its concern about the level of VAT gap estimated at 140 billion in 2018. So it's probably bigger now, you can imagine. So that's tackling tax fraud. Next slide, please. So there's 2 recommendations specifically. There are others, and the link was there, so you can look at the others if you want. So one was on recommendation C1 on e-invoicing. So the European Parliament calls on the Commission to set up a harmonized common standard for e-invoicing across the Union without delay. Now, obviously, we have EN 16931 there. So whereas businesses were taken into account when we developed this standard, we have to make sure that not only can businesses' requirements be included in the standard, but that it's also suitable for VAT reporting, so that all the information that's needed for the VAT report is in the invoice. So you just simply have to summarize it, maybe, no? And then they note that establish the role of invoicing in real-time reporting. So they're talking about having real-time reporting as the solution. But obviously all the member states will have to look at this and decide themselves. So then explore the possibility of a gradual introduction of obligatory invoicing across the Union by 2023. And that's probably a bit ambitious in my mind anyway. But some countries have already done this. So as Declan mentioned there, so we have to look at maybe even 2024 to have mandatory invoices. But this is what was approved and voted on by the European Parliament that they wanted by 2023. And then issuing invoices should be administered only via state-operated or certified systems with full data protection ensured. So that basically is talking about PEPAL, which Declan already mentioned. And then by 2023, examine the possibility that the system will provide a part or full tax compliance data or documents for eligible taxpayers, including the responsibility for compliance of these returns or parts of them. So that's basically saying the VAT returns should be electronic. So the idea there is, you can see from the timelines that they were talking about bringing in the mandatory invoicing by 2023, and in the meantime have examined what type of VAT report. So after the mandatory invoicing is there, they will have already hopefully agreed the standard for the reports based on those. So next slide, please. And then recommendation C2, alternative to the reduction of the VAT gap. So I'll just read it out. The European Parliament calls on the Commission to design and propose a standard for online reporting of data, so as we just mentioned, preferably by using data from e-invoicing, so that's EN 16931, and include efficient and highly secure centralized, decentralized data processing for detection of fraud. So they see the likes of PEPAL being useful to be able to detect fraud. The data will replace all existing reporting requirements in this area and cause the overall cost of compliance to be reduced, notably for SMEs. So this is always a theme that the Commission always says about, and said it also about electronic invoicing, that it must be simple for SMEs. And then use of blockchain or alternative technology can be considered. So such as artificial intelligence, obviously, to try and detect fraud as well. So next slide, please. So the key takeaways. So e-invoicing will soon be the predominant way to invoice, but you know, because it's probably going to be mandated within the next year or two. And VAT reporting will be standardized across the EU, so that will follow on soon after that. So the driver to it is the VAT gap, which we have to make e-invoicing mandatory for business to business as well as business to government. And then the VAT reporting should be built on top of that so that it's simpler to make a VAT return. To do this, of course, the accounting or ERP systems will need these features to be included. So this will hopefully drive ERP systems or financial management systems that, just like the PAYE system was done, when you do your payroll, you hit another button and it goes to revenue. So in this case, maybe at the end of the month or bi-monthly, that has to be agreed that you press the button and your VAT return is submitted directly from your system in a standard format. And so this is the start of the evolution to an automated way to trade and make your VAT returns, pay taxes. So next slide, please. So I have some sources of this. These are links to the sources that I used for these slides. So if you want more detail, you can look at these. And of course, the link is also in there in the slides for the European Parliament resolution if you want to see a bit more about that. And that's it. That's my thank you. So we'll go to the question and answer session now.
Well, thank you very much for that, Edmund. And that was a really interesting, similar to the same level of high presentation that we had received from both Nolan and Declan. And the points that really jumped out at me there were tax compliance, reducing the cost of compliance then on all, but especially for SMEs, and this move to an automated way to trade and pay taxes. And Edmund mentioned there the PAYE modernisation that took place in Ireland, and we can see that that was very successful. It has its teeth in problems like all new systems that are introduced, but it is working very well now. So that would give us confidence moving forward in the e-invoicing area as well. And we see that really there's going to be a move towards a standardized way for VAT reporting, and also the obligation that's going to come down the line, maybe not 2023, but 2022 is in nearly over now, but we're in July, that there's going to be a move to make it mandatory to send invoices electronically. So I'd like to thank all three panelists for the excellent presentations that they've done and given us today, and it really, really gives us confidence in e-invoicing going forward and the potential benefits for all through its adoption.